Welcome to lesson 2. This is the lesson about Indian culture, my favorite lesson. And the first topic is about India's family-oriented society. The family is still very much at the center of life in India, and people live in these extended family homes, and family takes priority and precedence over just about every aspect of their lives. So that means if there's a family problem, you might find them leaving work to attend to a family matter. All right, so let's just talk for a minute about communication and the English language. Okay, so all the countries I've flashed on this screen are, let's say, English speaking countries, but as you know, all of them speak English in a slightly different way. They may have different accents, they have different expressions. And sometimes people from one country don't understand the English of the people from another country. It takes some time to adjust to the accent and to the different expressions and ways of speaking. And that includes India. So you'll find that most people in India have an excellent skill level in English language. And in addition to English, they speak Hindi and probably at least 2 or 3 other regional languages. Most Indians speak several languages very well. But obviously, there are some differences in the way that they speak English. There are different expressions that they use. There's a slightly different accent. And as with working with people from any foreign country, it takes a little bit of adjustment and a little bit of communication, a little bit of time spent together to fully understand the different accent that people have. So one way we can look at the communication in India, we can use a term called high context communication. The terms high context and low context communication were coined by the interculturalist Edward Hall. So what is high context communication? Okay, so people from these cultures generally speak indirectly, they tend to avoid conflict, and they find difficulty in saying no directly, okay? They prefer verbal communication to writing emails. It's very important to communicate with them verbally in order for them to feel a connection with you. They consider it rude to be too direct. They always try to show respect and maintain harmony, especially in groups. They're excellent at building relationships, and they value group membership and tend to be more collectivist than individualist. They easily understand nonverbal clues and visual messages, for example, differences in tone of voice or facial expressions. And for them, time is very flexible, even cyclical. So instead of starting and stopping at a certain point, like the workday starts and then ends specifically at another point, they generally tend to view time as a flexible and ongoing rolling cycle. And they also have no problem with ambiguity or uncertainty. So changes in the schedule or unforeseen circumstances generally don't fluster them. All right. So can you think of some cultures that have these attitudes and this general way of behaving? Now, of course, there are lots of shades in between high context and low context. Some cultures are in between, but usually they are more on one side than another. And that, of course, includes India. So India is a classic high context culture. And some other countries with these tendencies in communication, probably you've been thinking about them so far. So we have also Arab countries, Far East Asian countries, and also Greek, Russian, Turkish, Persian, and Latin American cultures tend to be on the high context side as well. All right, so now let's talk about low context communication. So in low context cultures, people tend to speak directly and say what they mean. There's very little sugarcoating or beating around the bush or reading between the lines, let's say. They tend to communicate in structured messages with pertinent details, meaning information that answers the question who, what, when, where, why, how, etc. They tend to be suspicious of people who speak indirectly because they think that maybe they're hiding something if they don't speak directly. They rely on written communication a lot more than verbal communication, let's say in the high context cultures. They tend to stick to rules, laws, and written agreements. They're not as adept at reading nonverbal clues as high context communicators. They tend to be more task oriented than relationship oriented. They like their agendas and schedules. They're very punctual and organized, and they like to plan ahead for everything. They also tend to separate work life and family life. So, meaning that work is organized between certain hours, and then after that, it's over. And then I go home and spend time with my family. I have my hobbies, my free time, and I don't tend to overlap the two. Okay. So, they also get nervous with ambiguity and uncertainty. They like things to be defined, they like all the ducks to be in the row. They like to have everything laid out and organized before starting a project. All right. Again, these are general tendencies. There are lots of variations within cultures, but can you think of some examples of cultures with these tendencies? Probably you've thought of some already, and those include, of course, the US, Australia, Canada, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, and the UK, and Ireland as well. All right. So maybe you were able to see some of your tendencies inside one of these types, either high context or low context. The important thing to remember is that neither one is better or worse or right or wrong. It's just that they're different styles, and we just have to understand if we're working with someone who is of a different style. There's nothing wrong with that. We just have to figure out how we can bridge the gap. All right. So there is a scale of countries. This is a screenshot I've taken from this amazing book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, which I highly recommend reading. It goes into a lot of detail about low context and high context. It gives you also a lot of strategies, more than we can go into in this short course, but I just wanted to circle a few countries on the scale. You can see where India falls. It's high on the high context side, and then you can find UK, US, Canada, and Australia on the low context side. So please forgive me if your country is not listed here. This is a screenshot. I couldn't put all the countries, but this gives you a general idea of the two different styles of communication and what you could potentially expect when communicating with Indians. If you find yourself in the low context bucket and you're working with people from India, you might find some differences in communication. All right, so let's go into a little bit more detail about what differences in culture mean in terms of time now, because the way cultures use time is very different from culture to culture. Our perception of time, how we organize our work within the time, how we view time, how we use time, etc., is very different. There are two terms to help you explain this. They are monochronic and polychronic. Again, these terms were invented by the same interculturalist Edward Hall, if you wish to read more about it. In monochronic cultures, time is the given and people are the variable. So time is the fixed one that we have to organize ourselves around. The needs of people are adjusted to meet the demands of time. In other words, we hurry up to fit our work in and get it done during the time constraints that we have. Time is considered measurable. Only a limited amount is available. We must make efficient use of it, and we must plan well and plan ahead. People in monochronic cultures generally finish one task before starting another. All right, so now let's hear about polychronic cultures. All right, polychronic cultures generally, time is the servant and the tool of people. So in other words, time can be stretched to meet the needs of people. Schedules can be adjusted to suit the needs of people. More time is always available. People are never too busy to greet people during even a really busy time. And people often have to do several things simultaneously, and they usually have no trouble with this multitasking. All right. And it's not necessary to finish up one task before starting another. Now, can you see the differences, and can you see yourself? Which type are you? Which type is India? Well, if you guess polychronic, you are right. India is a classic polychronic culture. Again, there are a lot of variations, and individuals may be different. Individuals could have lots of different scores on the scale between monochronic and polychronic. And again, no type is better or worse than another. It's just a little bit different. It's important to know how time is viewed. And in different cultures, time has a completely different perspective. All right. So One last perspective is about group dynamics in India. And to explain this, we can use the terms collectivist and individualist. So, what is collectivism? Basically, collectivism means there's a very broad sense of community and harmony among groups. There are strong group dynamics and interdependence of people within each group. One's identity is derived largely from membership and role in a group, and survival of the group ensures success of the individual. People tend to think more about the well-being of the group or the community rather than their individual selves, and values are unity, brotherhood, and selflessness. Do you know some collectivist countries or cultures? Think about it for a minute. Let's see some examples. All right, of course, we have India there on the list, and Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, Nepal, Egypt. You can see many countries of the world, especially those that have very large populations, tend to be on the collectivist side. Again, there is a scale, so countries are not typically 100% one type or 100% another type. They might fall in between, but usually more on one side than another. All right, so now let's talk about the other side of the spectrum, individualism, which tends to be the way of the West. So in individualist cultures, people generally strive for individual success and recognition. The emphasis is on I and me and my achievements. Uniqueness is praised, and dependency on others is frowned upon. Self-sufficiency, independence, and self-reliance are very important and, in fact, essential to survival in these cultures. There's often a psychological and emotional distance from groups. People may choose to join groups, but it's not essential for success. This is more common in urban settings. Okay, so now can you think of some individualist countries? All right. And let's see some examples. We have the US, UK, Netherlands, Italy, Australia, Canada, you can see, and probably you can also imagine that these cultures tend to be on the individualist side. All right, so now let's just see a summary of the main Indian cultural values. So as we discussed, high context communication is normally the way, and you see the tendencies to speak indirectly, to avoid saying no directly to people's faces. Also, the desire to preserve relationships, avoid conflict, and the flexibility, both in their way of working and also their attitude towards time. And then the polychronic nature and the attitude towards organizing their schedule. It can be very flexible. They can easily multitask. They also generally have no issues with being interrupted or having last minute changes in the schedule. Then the collectivist nature of group dynamics. The identity is derived from groups. They have a strong sense of belonging and loyalty to groups, and personal connections are often leveraged. Okay, so finally, we have two other values that we didn't discuss yet, the status and networks and the resourcefulness. So in the status and networks value, just keep in mind that as a hierarchical society, status plays an important role for Indians. Throughout history, India's society had a clear social order and a hierarchy, and so they're quite used to this system. And networks and connections generally play a very important role. And finally, the resourcefulness, which is also sometimes called jugad or jugar, which means they are excellent at finding creative solutions to all kinds of problems. They know how to get things done at all costs. And sometimes bending the rules is okay in Indian society. So that concludes this short lesson on Indian values. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will see you in the next lesson.